In the day 2 notes, we're going to use the sum and difference formulas to help us solve equations. So we have the cosine of pi over 3 plus x plus the cosine of pi over 3 minus x equal to 1/2. And what we want to do is solve for x. So what we have to start with are our sum and our difference formulas. The first one we're going to get is from here. This is the cosine of alpha plus beta. So if we're using the addition with the cosine one, taking a look back at your cosine sum formulas, this is the cosine of pi over 3 times the cosine of x minus the sine of pi over 3 times the sine of x. And again, this is just coming from those formulas that you got yesterday. So take a look at the top of that sheet if you're not remembering, and that's where that's coming from, just the cosine of alpha plus beta. Then we're adding to that all this stuff, the cosine now of alpha minus beta. So here we're subtracting. So that formula is the cosine of pi over 3 times the cosine of x plus the sine of pi over 3 times the sine of x. And this is all equal to 1/2. Now, one thing I want you to be very careful with, and you're going to see this in the try this, so remember this. If this here is a subtraction sign, which you will see again in the try this, you need to make sure you put parentheses around this whole thing and distribute that negative before you do your next step. So one more time, if this is a subtraction sign, you must have parentheses around here and you must distribute that negative throughout. If you don't, everything's going to cancel out and you're going to have nothing to solve. So if you see something like that happen, think to yourself, maybe I forgot to distribute something, and go back and do that. Now, once we're here, we can look to combine like terms. So I have a cosine of pi over 3 cosine of x, and I have another cosine of pi over 3 cosine of x. So altogether, I have 2 cosine pi over 3's cosine of x's. Then if I see I have a negative sine pi over 3 sine of x and a positive sine pi over 3 sine of x, well, those are going to cancel each other out. They're opposites. And then this is set equal to 1/2. So I have simplified my problem down quite a bit. Then I can look to evaluate, and I want to evaluate the cosine of pi over 3. If I evaluate the cosine of pi over 3, pi over 3 is going to be in my first quadrant with a reference angle of 60 degrees. Cosine is going to be down here, which would be across from the 30 degrees. So cosine of pi over 3 is just 1/2. So I'm going to get 2 times 1/2 times the cosine of x equal to 1/2. So all I did is I took this cosine of pi over 3 and changed it to 1/2 because I could evaluate it. Now I can multiply these two things together. 2 times 1/2, well, that's just 1. So I have 1 times the cosine of x equal to 1/2. And 1 times cosine is just the cosine of x equal to 1/2. So now what I want to do is I want to figure out when is the cosine positive 1/2, and I'm looking to give all possible answers. So if I want to know when the cosine is equal to 1/2, I'm going to go ahead and set up my triangle. And remember that the cosine is positive in the first and the fourth quadrants. So I'm not going to be here or here. If I set up my triangle, this would be 1/2, giving me 30 up here, and then a reference angle of 60 degrees, which means I'm talking about pi over 3's. So I know that x is going to be equal to pi over 3 plus 2 pi times k. And I'm also going to be in the fourth quadrant. So if I think about pi over 3's, all the way around would be 6 pi over 3. Oops. So 1 less than that would be 5 pi over 3. So I also know that I have 5 pi over 3 plus 2 pi times k, again where k is any integer. And here's my answer. If you have questions, let me know. Otherwise, I'd like you to do the try this. Remember, you have the negative sign here in between, so you're going to need parentheses and you're going to need to distribute. So go ahead and pause it now and unpause it when you're ready to check your answer. If you did the try this correctly, I want you to remember this one is specifying it only on 0 to 2 pi, where the last problem we were able to add that 2 pi k. On this one you don't need to, and that's because of the 0 to 2 pi. So your answer here should just be 5 pi over 6 and 7 pi over 6. If you have questions, let me know.